Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Interior Design Lecture Series for the fall. This evening, I'm really pleased to welcome a friend of many of us here, a former professor at CCA. Igor Siddiqui is the principal of ISSSStudio. I don't know, how do you pronounce the whole S? You can say the way I want. ISSStudio. A design practice that was established in Brooklyn in 2006. His current research focuses on encounters between manufactured products and architectural spaces, resulting in works that interrogate part-to-whole relationships, design and fabrication technologies, and the expanded gradients between interior and exterior environments. His work focuses primarily on novel relationships between architectural space and the decorative arts, viewed through the lens of technological innovation. And as such, I think for many of the students here today, it is quite topical on research that they're doing in their studios. He is an assistant professor at the University of Texas in Austin at the School of Architecture. His practice, teaching, and research have been recognized for effectively operating across the fields of product design, interior design, and architectural design. The work of ISSStudio has been exhibited at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, Descours in New Orleans, Flux Factory, the Center for Architecture, and the Metro Show Art Fair in New York, Arthouse and Design Within Reach in Austin, Forum Gallery in Perth, Australia, and Axis Gallery in Tokyo. Igor's work has been published in Idea Journal, Interior Ecologies, Soft Shells, Porous and Deployable Architectural Screens, Anti-Art Journal, Constructs, Yale Architecture, and Interior Design Magazine, Dwell, Tribiza, and Snap, as well as numerous features on sites such as DZine, Arcanet, ArcDaily, Treehugger, and Sucker Punch. A gifted teacher, Igor Siddiqui has taught throughout his professional career with me at the University of Pennsylvania, here at the California College of the Arts, and before that at New York Institute of Technology and Parsons, the New School for Design. In New York, he worked with the firm 1100 Architect between 1999 and 2006, and Cohn Pedersen Fox Associates in the late 90s as well. Born and raised in Croatia, he received his Bachelor of Architecture from Tulane University, followed by the post-professional Masters of Architecture from Yale University. I'm really excited to see the current work he has to show us, and he promised that he will also tell us about the process and tell us about teaching and the profession and the kind of tripartite practices that many of us do try and maintain. So please join me in welcoming Igor Siddiqui.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for such a nice introduction. It's really nice to see all the familiar faces. It's quite an honor and a pleasure to be back here at CCA. I love coming back here. I love teaching here. And it's a special occasion for me this time, not only to see the colleagues, UT graduates who now live in the Bay Area, who are in the audience, and CCA graduates who were my students a few years ago, but also because the work that I will show today really started here for just a little bit over 4 years ago. So it's been a very exciting and somewhat daunting process of kind of looking back and kind of figure out what I've done with myself over the past 4 years. Since I was last here, I started teaching at the University of Texas at Austin. And at UT, I teach in both architecture and interior design programs. And it's interesting because about 80% of my students at UT are architecture students, maybe even more than that. But I've really been charged with contributing to our small but growing interior design program. And so it's really For me to come here, I think it's exciting to talk to my colleagues and people that I went to college with, and but it's especially, this talk is really meant for the interior design students here at CCA, because those are the issues that the program here is dealing with are the issues that we're very much dealing with at UT, and I think the discipline or the field of study has been dealing with as well. As Catherine mentioned, along with teaching, I run ISSStudio, which truly is a studio and not quite a firm. I sort of hated when people pretend that they have big sort of firms or sweatshops behind their names, and in reality it's mostly just them working on their computer or putting things together with zip ties or whatever. So it's really a studio practice. I spend quite a bit of time working by myself. Sometimes I work with collaborators. Sometimes there are students that are involved, sometimes there are interns. But it's small and it's flexible, and I think that there are certain qualities in the work that come out of that as well, for better or worse. So what I will talk about today is really the relationship between the practice, between ISSStudio, and some of the things that I've been doing with my students at the advanced level of teaching at UT. But before I show the work, I guess I want to start sort of at the beginning, where I come from and where I guess the framework for what I do comes from. When people ask me what I do say, as Catherine mentioned, that my work kind of resides at the intersection of architecture and decorative arts. I find that intersection very exciting. Architecture, because that's really all I know, that's all I have ever done. But I find myself at this really interesting moment where other allied disciplines have been welcoming venues and hosts and audience for what I do, so I'm very grateful for that. It's also a really interesting moment for issues like decoration and ornament to kind of be a part of the repertoire of what we do as designers. I will begin here with a quote by Keller Easterling that I think captures some of the sensibility. And she said it's a short nugget of a piece, a short essay that she wrote for the journal volume. It came out right after I got out of graduate school. I was a student of Keller's. I think she was here last week for the symposium. But she says in the essay "Not Everything," where the title of my lecture comes from, with parentheses, I guess indicating a level of ambivalence, but it's nonetheless based on that. Inventors of games and hush puppies enjoy the incomplete and irreducible. Architects, however, sometimes wish to design everything as if playing a predetermined game of solitaire. Trained to design modulars and master plans, we're distinguished among designers by our desire to command the entire field. The morphology of the built landscape is created not by master plans, but by contagious details and protocols. Elevators, cars, and real estate formulas create urban epidemics. Technology spread from nose cones to hair dryers, and from girdles to golf clubs. Fads, errors, and bottom lines pass across urban fabric, leaving millions of acres altered. So I guess to me, this kind of self-criticism coming from architecture, this kind of obsession with controlling everything really resonated, and it still does. And I would say that my work, or I guess my attitude about my work, I think at least partially comes from that sensibility. I think that Keller's quote brings up the issue of total design, which for me, being a part of architecture and coming from that discipline and kind of working across disciplines, the kind of the 19th century idea of the total work of art, and then also appropriated into by architects as a total work of design, has both been the enabler for me and also kind of a problem. And so on the one hand, my old school colleagues understand that someone like me can, let's say, teach interior design because they love Bauhaus and Cranbrook, and they think that architects can do everything. But I do think that the world has changed a little bit in terms of how we operate. So for the students especially, there are really two essays that kind of bracket or, let's say, bookend my ideas about total design and how it's evolved from this kind of 19th century idea of a total work of art and how we think of it today. There are two issues of the Harvard Design Magazine that have produced two essays that are kind of in conversation with one another. So in 1998, there was a special issue of Harvard Design Magazine. My colleagues here probably know the essay. It's by Mark Wigley, and the essay is Whatever Happened to Total Design. And then the kind of the follow-up to that a decade later, from 2009, is Michael Meredith's essay, Whatever Happened to Total Design. And I think it's a really interesting way to begin to frame how people like myself and Amy and Catherine and so on find ourselves in this kind of situation where we're kind of working across disciplines. So for Mark Wigley, and those of you, my students who are in the audience, read these essays in my seminar. But essentially what I will say is that Mark Wigley identifies the history of total design in architecture as one that is bipolar in nature. It's either implosive or it's explosive in nature. And so if we look at precedents, we can say that Peter Behrens's house in Darmstadt in the late 19th century is a good example of implosive design, meaning that it's a fully contained interior within which every single thing is completely designed by the architect. So it's not just a building, it's not just the paneling, it's not the furniture, but it's also the mosaics that were produced by Villeroy and Boch, the famous industrial manufacturer that does ceramics, all the way to the custom piano that was designed by the architect. And we see examples of this, of course. We're familiar with them, but I'll just quickly kind of go through the 20th century with examples of this kind of idea of the implosive interior. So of course we all know Reichwald Schroeder House. And an example that I wanted to show because it's a building that I went to recently. It's Alvar Aalto's Maison Carrée, about 2 hours west of Paris. And it's actually a project that's only recently, or it's a building that's only recently been open to the public. So I don't think that it's as extensively published or known as some of his other houses in Finland. And this is a late Alvar Aalto project. It's from the mid-60s, and so at this point he already had this whole body of work of mass-produced products, lighting, furniture, and so he designs the house, the landscape, and everything within it was touched by Aalto's studio in some way. So here you see the dining room on the left with the furniture, the lighting, and so you kind of you get the idea. And then also a very recent example, artist Jorge Pardo's enormous compound in Mexico that just opened this year is really conceived. I mean, maybe the rhetoric is a little bit different because we are in the 21st century, but it's essentially an idea of a total work of art where it's the landscape, the architecture, the art, it all kind of contributes toward a kind of a singular experience controlled by the artist. So I would argue that these examples are what Wigley refers to as the implosive, and then you have the explosion of total design, where the architect is really entitled to design everything in the world, right? From everything from silverware to urban master plans. So of course here we go back to Peter Behrens. We see his groundbreaking electric kettle for AEG. And then a detail of the turbine factory building that he designed in Berlin for the same company when he became the AEG's creative director. Of course, Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion car, this kind of idea that architecture can propagate itself through limitless typologies. Of course, my favorite, Superstudio, right, where the ubiquitous grid. I mean, of course, here there's an element of humor and critique as well, but again, kind of capturing this attitude about what architecture's reach might be. And then a recent example, you know, by the genius architect that gets to do jewelry or entire parts of Turkish cities. So that would be Mark Wigley's kind of what he calls the bipolarity of architecture's conception or notion of total design. So then a decade later, Michael Meredith revisits this for the same publication, and he's really kind of struggling because it seems like he was either given or he gave himself the task of discussing the work of the Bourrelec brothers, the French industrial designers, whose work really deals or is kind of situated at the intersection of product interior design and architecture. And so he kind of struggles to figure out kind of discursively how to deal with it. And he references Mark Wigley's article and essentially says this: although Wigley's article seemed accurate and influential 10 years ago, I believe that design has since changed fundamentally. For the time being, architecture, design, art, and even theory have all given up on the search for a grand unifying theory or language, or a single equation or individual narrative that could describe the universe. Design now seeks ever more specific and situated niches. It is inclusive but not universalizing. Internal autonomous demands are the absolute measurements of geometric systems are being replaced with relative systems of measure, mood, and atmosphere. Utopia has been replaced with micro-utopias. These micro-utopias, micro-environments of newfound specificity, overwhelm and frustrate total design. So it was, and so you see, especially for the students, it's nice to see some of these projects by the Bourrelec brothers. I think what's identified is the kind of the reality of this kind of niche condition and a different kind of sensibility where perhaps in one's body of work it's possible to touch upon different typologies, different kinds of sites, but it's not a kind of a totalizing strategy. Now, one point to make that I think brings these two articles together is that there is a relationship to these issues of total design in relation to technology. So Wigley actually argues that both the implosive and the explosive total design are reactions to mass production. The implosive is basically a retreat or escape from the kind of the repetition of mass production. So the interior becomes the place where everything can be customized, controlled, and precious, while the explosive is actually the embrace of that same technology where, of course, it becomes possible to kind of repeat architecture's agenda at different scales through industrial production. So my argument would be that as we have shifted from mass production to mass customization, that what has changed are not just forms, but also how we work. And so this idea of mass customization, I think, also define how it is that we navigate practice and how we navigate the world through what we do. So this is Burlick Brothers clouds. And so what I will do is the blues are ISSStudio projects clustered through themes, and then the greens are teaching-based projects that that relate to the professional work. I will begin with tile. So when I was actually at CCA and I was trying to figure out what to do with myself and how I wanted to practice, after I left New York, one of the first things that I got to do was actually work with a materials company from New York that wanted me to figure out how to integrate digital fabrication into their products. And so, of course, I always loved this Super Studio image as well, and this kind of idea of kind of colonizing the context. It's kind of like the life without buildings, where there's the landscape and there is the interior. And so this was my version of it, and what we're trying to do is figure out how to use their standard carpeting and kind of reframe it in a different way, but by introducing pattern to it. This was at a time, of course, when I guess 3D printing, there was a little bit of 3D printing. I hadn't done a lot of it, so it was really a lot of laser cutting. In the industry, there was water jet cutting, and so it was really about 2D cuts for the most part. And so this was one project. This was the felt tessel tile that I did for them as a kind of study. And the idea was really to take stock material and water jet cut it and restack it with minimal or no waste in a way that it could produce a textured product. So this is in many ways still in the mass-produced paradigm, because it's a single kind of tile that produces difference, but there's really not any variation. It's really only by the virtue of the 120-degree turn that you get some difference, but it's the same tile over and over again. And then this was a way to begin to look at what happens when you use different stock of material and you start kind of playing with colors. Of course, the Ruckstahl felt was coming from Switzerland. The company was in New York, and the only place where we could actually get someone to assemble this, because ultimately it would have had to be done manually, was in India. So it really didn't make that much sense as a product in the end, but it was an interesting study. And then, of course, at a certain point, it's like your computer ends up being the kind of the host or the container for all these different patterns that never become anything. And then James of Wrapped Studio said, well, let's make some ceramic tile for one of the projects. So one of the patterns that I had, we worked with Wrapped Studio here from San Francisco and a factory in New Hampshire, and with just a little bit more money managed to produce a custom tile that was installed, in San Mateo somewhere. But it came out of another study, really, where I was looking at how things can tessellate in relation to how you quantify seams. So this particular tile was kind of the sweet spot between kind of a square tile and a hex, but kind of concealing the ubiquitous hex with a different kind of geometry. And so then this is the tile installed. So it was really these like micro projects, I guess, that were the kind of the testing ground and still are the testing ground. So it's like a lot of stuff in the computer and then a little bit of material output, but that's okay because it's still making progress. And then finally, this project happened. which was really exciting because finally I was working on a product where it's truly serially differentiated, where every single piece is different from the rest. And that was really nice to do. So this is the tessellated floorscape, which is both a kind of a commercial product, but it was a prototype, and you'll see it's been installed in many different situations. I always say that this is the project that does work while I'm asleep, because it just kind of goes places and becomes different things. But the idea here was that Aronson's floor covering, who I have a working relationship with and have for years, it's someone that we went to college with actually, they were actually trying to come up with a short-term way of dealing with carpet tile waste. And one of the things about carpet tiles is that they have rubber backing, and so they can't be recycled in the same way that regular carpeting can be. So of course this isn't a sort of a cradle-to-cradle solution, but it was a short-term solution to kind of expanding the life cycle of their product so that these things wouldn't go to a landfill, and then you could actually use different products by different manufacturers and kind of put them together into another cohesive whole. So the idea here was really, and so you kind of see the rubber backing here. This is before they were installed for the first time, so the double stick tape was nice and fresh and not yet peeled off. Just diagrams for how it was produced. So the idea was that every time you would water jet cut a rug, you could extract a different pattern, which was constrained by the surface onto which it was projected. There are a couple of problems with it, and you kind of see here that it's been, so this was like the Industrial Designer Society of America show. This was Flux Factory. These were like participatory workshops that an artist was doing. I think they had no idea that the carpet was actually an installation. I think that they just thought that it came with the office that this thing was in. It came back so filthy from this one, but we clean it with this corn husk powder. So, and then here it was used as a part of a video set by a New York artist. And then it was also a design within reach. I think its final home is actually quite nice. It's much nicer than where I live. This is a house in Austin by Bercy Chen, and this is its permanent home. This is also a really amazing house with an amazing, enormous green roof. And this picture actually comes out of, I think, this month's issue of Dwell's Houses We Love. So I'm very happy with the destiny of this piece. So of course, what I was interested in also parallel to that was begin to deal with surface in a way that is, let's say, thick and three-dimensional. And so one of the things that I've been looking at for the past few years and slowly writing about was the kind of the reemergence of floral form and pattern in design. Of course, flowers are ubiquitous and persist throughout different cultures, times, and geographies. But other than fashion and maybe textile design, that kind of disappeared for a century or so. And then about 15 years ago, we started seeing the reemergence of the floral across sort of unlikely disciplines. And so, of course, this is Greg Lynn's Costa Rican Visitor Center, Museum Visitor Center, with a kind of floral form. This is Tord Buntier, and of course Elena Manfredini that everyone knows. And so this was work that began, and I told Catherine that I would show a bunch of projects that seemed like sort of dead ends, and then other things happened from there. And this was one of them. It was just a lot of making, and then this was in 2010, and it's like the project that kind of still keeps figuring itself out in different ways. This was one of the first things that I made with my new sewing machine at UT. And the idea was really to try to figure out how to go from sort of, let's say, print to geometry, but also how to deal with soft materials, which are really difficult to deal with. And so this was the kind of this piece, Bougainvillea. It was a pretty simple component. And basically the way that it works is there are 3 point-to-point connections in the front and 3 in the back. And it's kind of a torqued form which keeps the whole thing in tension. So what you end up with is actually a pretty nice kind of three-dimensional net that actually hangs pretty well. It's like a kind of a soft space frame in a way. But it didn't do any... and it's made from ripstop nylon, which meant that it could be cut without having to deal with seams, which is consistently an issue that I have to deal with because you just can't finish all the seams if you have so many cuts. And this will come up in other projects as well. But it didn't really do anything as far as the kind of the control of the porosity was, because the material is so soft that it just kind of does its own thing. Actually, the kind of the formal variation doesn't register because the kind of the softness of the material is stronger than the form in a way. So it actually made more sense to just make the same component and repeat it over and over again. And so part of that was an adventure in trying to figure out how to get a factory to make this. So you can send it somewhere and you can pretend that it's like a bikini or something and just tell them to make it and not tell them that it will become something bigger. And so this project became a proposal for the Istanbul Biennial, where we're looking at kind of different markets and the kind of the cost of manufacturing. And then the kind of the different components of different colors became a kind of a quantifiable way to see labor cost and manufacturing cost. So again, it's kind of a project that was, kind of interesting and kind of a dead end, but then it then comes back in a different way because you have to figure out other things about it. Just this summer, I got a call from a developer that wanted to use this as a permanent. I was telling Catherine this as a permanent. I guess, canopy above the pool for their boutique hotel. And of course, that's like a completely different set of problems because this isn't engineered. So, it's like every time it comes up, it brings up different issues that need to be dealt with. So in some ways, it's kind of slow and impossible, and then in other ways it's kind of exciting. But one of the things that I kind of moved away from the first prototype to this prototype was that I was trying to make kind of edge-to-edge connections between the components so that the porosity could be dealt with better. And so that worked in some way. You see that the components are differentiated, but then another thing happened because there's gravity. And so when you install something vertically, actually the geometry of the components actually revealed another set of apertures that, in the digital realm, when they were just templates for cutting, they were next to each other. But of course, when they drape, so we discovered this kind of inversely dependent or proportional set of apertures. So it's like I would have never thought to necessarily model this, but it just kind of emerged as like actually a very obvious rule of that particular system. And then what I was doing is trying to capture some of that information. So rather than modeling the thing that was already, or kind of remodeling the thing that was already made and that already existed, kind of modeling the findings, so the edges and the apertures. And that actually became the system for this competition, which is the Solar Floral project. So in a way, this ended up being kind of a, let's say, a form-finding model, for the lack of a better term, just applied at a different scale. Because actually what was interesting about this finding, or about some of this insight, was the kind of the sectional thickness actually changed with the changes in these seams. And so at another scale that actually, and oriented horizontally, that became much more meaningful, because then you could occupy the section in a very different way, so that there was space below and above. So in this project, the idea was to say, okay, there are no umbrellas and lounge chairs, because there's a system that has the ability to synthesize those two things. So, and then this was the third failure in the series, which was, so the orange prototype looked at point-to-point connections, the blue one looked at edge-to-edge conditions, and so in this prototype, I was looking at face-to-face connections. And so the idea was, I thought, well, ripstop nylon sucks and felt isn't working, and so I'm going to make my own textile. So I decided to cast a textile that had a kind of texture, with the idea that then those textures could, you could have the kind of the button and the hole. And so, at first we were able to cast something this big. And it sort of worked, but it really didn't want to do any of the things that I fantasized about. So we kind of shelved that away for a little bit, but you will see that then it comes back in another project. So these things, I guess, just go to exhibits until we figure out what to do with them in some other way, more applied way. And so this kind of way of working and not knowing what's going to happen also translates into my teaching. I teach an advanced seminar called Prototype, where we of course engage with issues of fabrication, with the question of what it means to make things at full scale, what it means to anticipate industrial production rather than site construction. But really, what motivates me, and I think what kind of runs through all the projects, is the kind of the ongoing catalog of projects that deal with serial difference. So a very simple idea that if I make a series, of course, the two things are never the same, and that happens sometimes through digital technique, sometimes it happens through materials, sometimes it happens through assembly. So it's really different for each student project. And so this is a project where the student took on. So usually what the students do is they begin with a kind of a digital method of generating serial difference, whether it's a very simple definition in Grasshopper. In this case, it's parametric array, because now we have Cori. So this was designed for 3D printing. And so in this project, the idea was that actually the only way that you could make this was through 3D printing. So there was no other kind of surrogate or kind of the model making was all the prototyping and the manufacturing idea were one and the same. The second project, actually, Nick Kinnair is here. He was my student at UT last spring, and he and Mega looked at a definition that considered the role of, let's say, resolution of curvature, so the number of control points, and the kind of creation of asymmetries along with this kind of radial arrangement, and then very obsessively, not only looked at the kind of the formal variation, but then used different 3D printers to output the prototypes, CNC routed, laser cut. So they really kind of made a catalog for themselves of what this could be and whether there was any material feedback that was relevant. I mean, there are lots of things, actually, Nick can tell you, that didn't make it into, I mean, there was chocolate, there were some really messy ones, but this is really what they ended up with, which was quite good. And then also some of the accidents that happen along the way, like what happens when there's a glitch in 3D printing, and so you start getting these slices, right, which are actually not something that they meant to do, but then they kind of discovered that as a technique for actually exploiting this kind of formal vocabulary further. Then Jen Wang, another student, she became very obsessed with just using a 3-axis CNC router, but determined to make 3-dimensional form that was cut. So they were double cuts, but not just top and bottom, but they would also be hollow on the inside. So you see, but it was also, I mean, she had so many kind of constraints that she, but it was also plywood kind of used perpendicular to the grain, or perpendicular to the ply. So you see the investigation here. There were 2 simple grasshopper definitions. There are 2 kind of families, and then she went through kind of different materials and very slowly figured out some stuff. And this is probably, I mean, this is actually such a beautiful piece. It's this crazy kind of bone, but it's everything. I mean, it's every surface has been touched by the bit and has been modeled. So there's not a single piece of this that is kind of the material as it came. It was really quite a bit of work. And then this project is quite different. This student decided to use the lathe and create eccentricity within a technique that really doesn't want to do that. And so here the idea of kind of serial difference is very different because it's within a kind of continuum. So it's kind of like maybe like a Brancusi sculpture on acid or something. But then also kind of studying that in relation to what the rules are for the kind of settings, for the jigs, for the so kind of going back and forth between making and then trying to figure these things out through drawings, really. And then you see the process here. So that was like all the way on the right is the kind of the extreme example of the kind of eccentricity. That's probably the point at which, you know, he almost got injured, but he was fine. So there is that. Then a very different kind of project that was driven by material. It's getting late. Which was, I'll speed up, which was wax and using water as formwork. And this was actually a project that was prototyped at the AA that they wanted to take on, further. And so they kind of simulated this process of kind of having an iterative process with the material that would result. So the variation was based on materials. And they really worked very hard to figure out how to make wax more permanent of a material by sort of adding different dusts to it, but also thinking sort of the bigger picture and kind of looking at the petroleum industry and thinking of wax as a kind of industrial byproduct. So they were also thinking about what this might mean kind of regionally or politically or economically. So they imagined that this project could actually be a pilot project somewhere in Louisiana, probably in New Orleans, that could plug itself into the regional industry that actually produces wax as a petroleum byproduct. And then another wax-obsessed project, these students figured out how to capture the kind of the drips and make them permanent. So it's kind of like wax that has been covered in resin. So these are actually quite hard, and you see these students actually took it a little bit further and were kind of determined to make a kind of a product out of it. So there was it was lighting, and you see the kit on the left. So so these projects don't always result in something that's useful right away, but we learn a lot from them. And I think a good example is the project that Matt and I worked on in New Orleans, bioluminescence. So Matt Hutchinson should be presenting this project with me. He's the most amazing collaborator. So we were one of 10 projects selected for Descours, which is it's an event that went on for about 5 years in New Orleans. It was done by the American Institute of Architects in New Orleans, and basically the idea for the event was that you could use architectural installations to bring the public into parts of the city and sites that are not otherwise accessible to the public. So everything from dark alleys to abandoned buildings, that these installations were really the reason why people would go to some of these places and actually get to know their city in a different way. So our project is the 10th one. So of course you see that the first 9 are like clustered all together, and then the 10th one, like they had to make the map bigger to include ours. But the trade-off was that our project was in a much cooler part of town than everybody else's. So that was good. It was in the Marigny at the end of a dark alley. Okay, here we go. So this is the installation during the day. And so you see, it's actually, no, it's the same. The computer is not collaborating with me quite as well as I'd like it to. But you see that it's the same technique from the florals research. But after 2 years of working on it, I actually figured out how to make it not just an 8-inch diameter piece, but actually something that's about 9 feet. I mean, what was the biggest piece was about 2 feet by 9 feet or something like that. And there were 12 of them. And this was a super exciting project. Matt just set up his metal shop, and I wanted to cast these things bigger. And we never really saw each other throughout the whole process, but we managed to work with pretty close tolerances. So Matt did all the steel fabrication in San Francisco, and I did all the rubber fabrication in Austin, and it all came together in New Orleans, and we installed it within, I think, 4 hours or something like that. So the piece is meant to be looked at night, and that's really where it kind of, I think, for me, it goes beyond the technique and it becomes about effect. And so the scale of it is really constrained by 4x8 sheets of material that were used for the formwork for the rubber. One of the issues is that it's difficult to have seams in the formwork and still be able to cast the textile. So I think the biggest piece was about 9 feet, and it meant that we were able to use a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of MDF kind of diagonally, and that was it. but it was all kind of integrated into the design process. So the idea was that this was a kind of a weird creature at night. So we didn't really, it wasn't actually bioluminescent, but it was bioluminescent. And so you see the kind of the lighting effect and the way that it animates this otherwise dark alley that at the street level you wouldn't really think of as a kind of public space. This is also an interesting project from the point of view of interior design, because even though it's outside, it really deals with one of the essential things about the interior, which is artificial lighting, right? But it looks at that at a pretty unconventional scale. And then just a little bit about the process. So there is the steel armature, and then there are 12 unique panels. So each panel is different. And then within that, I mean, there's a logic to the pattern within the panel, but that is also customized to begin to deal with variations in density, texture, and all the things that would be broadcast by light at night. And this is really where it all came together, and it lived on Dropbox. And you know, it's just, we wouldn't have been able to do this even 10 years ago, not because we wouldn't have been able to model it or figure it out, but because there was no Dropbox. So, and then this was you see the shallow relief formwork on the right. By the way, we decided that we would make this piece on October 15th, and the installation opened December 1st. So it was kind of a crazy time, but also one of my favorite periods of time in the last recent memory. So on the left was actually the first success of releasing the skin from the mold, and then you just see one of the 12 panels that were used for the shallow relief formwork, and then these are two scenes from Matt's shop. So you see the armature, and then you see Matt's meticulous craft on the right. A view from above. Some of the details. So one of the confessions, and this is something that both Matt and I really didn't like, is that originally the tabs that connect the rubber pieces to the bottom ring were designed so that they could be pierced, sort of like an ear, with the hooks that were welded onto the ring. But we got really nervous about it, because if it had started snapping kind of systematically, we would have lost the piece. So we used zip ties there, which is kind of, which we didn't like very much, but it's true. So this question of temporary installations in relation to the city, I decided to deal with in an advanced studio this last year at UT. So of course South by Southwest is an event that Austin is known for, and what happens during those 2 weeks is that in a very short period of time, the city is really transformed really through temporary programming and temporary installation. So while the kind of the convention center is a hub for the program and the kind of the let's say the trade fair component, it really takes over the city. And so one of the questions that I had was, who's doing all this work? Like, there's so many installations, there seems to be so much work, but it doesn't seem like architects or interior designers are particularly involved in any of it. And so I wanted, this was specifically an interior design studio that didn't have an envelope to deal with, actually, and that actually started with the city and with with the economics of the event rather than a kind of a given envelope. And so there were two research components to the studio. The first one was looking at South by Southwest as an urban phenomenon. South by Southwest started in '86, and this was the first studio that dealt with it as an event or as an urban phenomenon at our architecture school ever, which seemed shocking to me, but it's true. So they had to, they made a book dealing with, I mean, they had to, I just told them to find out everything. And then the second part of the research was to figure out how you could, they basically started with 5 recent design innovations that are in the air right now. And it was full-scale 3D printing, robotic assemblies, smart materials, pollutant neutralizing finishes, and the 5th one I can't remember right now. What was the 5th one? A really important one. And so the students really had to rethink both site and program. So they had to rethink, well, what would a site be for an event like this, but also what is a program for an installation if it's not the kind of the program that we think of it conventionally? Because really the program for most of these installations is showcasing the innovation, right? And so if South by Southwest can be the kind of the launching pad for everything from electric cars to new energy drinks, why can't it also be an event where the kind of the public comes into contact and experiences some of the innovations that we're dealing with in the design industry? So this project is dealing with smart materials, and so it's looking at piezoelectricity. And so for this student, the site strategy was to capture 6th Street, which is kind of like the Bourbon Street of Austin. So that's the kind of the middle road that you see, as a way of activating the kind of the alleys that are underpopulated that run parallel to it. So then it became this kind of temporary infrastructural move to kind of release some of the traffic from 6th Street and redistribute it into the alleys, and then for the piezoelectric material to generate power to illuminate and service the alleys. You kind of see that here. I'll go through these things pretty quickly, or else I don't think we're going to eat dinner. And then this is the other project that's looking at 3D printing at full scale and what that means in terms of programming it as an event. So kind of taking into account the kind of the slowness of 3D printing as a kind of experience, and then also what it means to deal with the mass after the event. And so we're getting to the last bits and pieces here. I guess the second studio, advanced studio at the same level, was the Art Fair studio, and the idea here was to look at another kind of temporary urban phenomenon, that of art fairs, where thousands and thousands of square feet are temporarily transformed. So why aren't interior designers doing that either? But it's like event planners. So we worked with the Texas Contemporary Art Fair and the George Brown, the Convention Center in Houston. The site was 135,000 square feet, and the event is up for 3 days. So really kind of looking at kind of prefabrication strategies, and also looking at how some of these kind of pattern-based strategies could be scaled up so that they could work at the scale of spatial organization rather than, let's say, surface or ornament. And so this student patterns were generated differently. Here it's just a very simple insight about the kind of overlay of two patterns within a single system, a kind of a shifted grid and a hex pattern, and how the organization of the kind of front of house and back of house becomes a kind of a sectional rather than a plan-based organization. Just look at some of these. The other thing about the site itself is that you enter it from the concourse above. So the first thing that you see of any art, of anything that's happening at the convention center, is from the kind of the aerial perspective. So it was actually the perfect site to deal with in terms of pattern and organization. And then I'll quickly show this other project that looked at another set of patterns and dealing with the kind of the existing distribution of services within the space, and then how it gets modified by this overlaid organization. Kind of the magenta is an inflatable system that is both a kind of a canopy, but also is flattened to include things like lighting, and then it's plugged into the kind of the regular service grid of the convention center. And then this takes me to a project that ISSStudio did for an art fair. That was the Metro Shore Art Fair this past January in New York. And this, along with another project, will be kind of the last bit where we look at printing. So it's really about kind of going back from 3D to 2D and kind of looking at the potential of the kind of the graphic surface to make space. And I will talk about why that has been important. For one, it has to do with this kind of hangover from working on kind of component-based projects where everything is additive and you start small and you hope that you will end up big in the end. And then for this particular project, we also weren't really sure because we weren't making the thing itself. We had no idea what was possible. So our only control was really in the printing process, because we're working with a manufacturer or with a fabricator that only makes standard art fair booths. So we had to work with them, and so the project was in New York. The company, the art fair company, is in Chicago, and their shops were in Michigan. So also everything had to be brought from Michigan to New York, and this was up for a week. So a pretty significant art fair at the Metropolitan Pavilion in New York. It's an art fair that it has recently been rebranded. It's one whose scope includes both new works, but also more traditional collectibles. So, so one of the things that they wanted us to do is to design an entry piece that could somehow talk about or address this kind of relationship between the kind of the traditional and the contemporary. And so for us, it actually made sense to deal with a kind of the wallpaper as a kind of link between traditional craft and this kind of digital craft or graphics that we were working with. And so the overall project is about 100 linear feet divided into 3-foot wide panels. And so there are a few layers that kind of give it a sense of depth and space. So the first layer works with the actual depth of the facets or the geometry of the panels themselves. The kind of the gradient of color, with the darker being at the inner corners and the lighter at the outer. So that was one layer. I collaborated on this with Deborah Schneiderman, so who teaches at Pratt. So the two different kind of wallpaper patterns were kind of two different ways of dealing with wallpaper. So the green Deborah was dealing with in this kind of 19th century way where you repeat the same thing every time. And then the blue is actually just a simple circle packing script that has a kind of a radial a set of radial lines embedded within it. And so it produces this kind of floral pattern that never repeats. On top of that, we had this kind of virtual lace. And you kind of see some of that organization here. The interior, which is red, was hand-painted canvas. And then you kind of see that actually the geometry was constrained by 10-degree increments, which was really mostly helpful in helping the fabricator figure out the miters. You see the piece here. And then there was one more layer, which is the red, which is the kind of the anamorphic layer. So, of course, the 16th century painting of the skull with the kind of anamorphic view. So what we did was we took content from the art fair and kind of projected it onto the surface of the installation so that within certain points of view, you would get these kind of aligned figures. You have Corey Beeg as our scale figure. And then the last part of the installation was the kind of the virtual shadow that the piece casts. And so we had the flooring, which actually becomes the kind of the entry sequence from the front of the pavilion over there into the art fair. And so with a kind of a synthetic light source that defines what the outline of the shadow is. And then this is a project that I will end with that just opened on Friday. So it's an installation that I did as a participatory workshop with students in Austin. So it's kind of taking the tradition of textiles and printing and thinking about block printing, but also thinking about digital printing. So again, this piece is 10 feet in width and 15 feet in height. The premise is pretty simple. We came up with a way to generate a series of floral templates that don't repeat, just based on 4 different rules. The number of sides in the polygon, the type of petal, the scale, and then the order of lofting. The issue that we had, of course, is that at this size, we couldn't laser cut it, and we didn't have the budget to go to tech shop and use the big vinyl cutter. So actually decided that we would have a workshop and not just have the students cut, but actually determine the pattern as well. So it became a way to start with motifs that are digitally generated, but also come up with a piece, which is, I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of like kindergarten meets grad school, but it's been a really interesting process. And so it was a way to take something like printing and have something that's thin but not flat. And so the piece has 2 very different sides to it, because the cutouts make the perforations, and then the leftover figures are reattached to one of the sides. And then the other side ends up getting all the kind of residue from the connections. And so you kind of see those things spooled. And so this is one side, but that's actually, and then this is the side that you see when you enter. So in the other project, it was kind of using digital lines as a way of conveying material, and here it's almost like using material as a way of producing a drawing. Like, it really doesn't look real until you get up close. The piece is situated in the gallery, which has a show that's kind of curated along the perimeter. So it's the first screen that you see. This is the kind of the front that you see when you enter, and then when you turn back, you see this piece. Yeah, so this just went up. And of course, the obvious references for this piece would be the work of Sheila Hicks and Todd Bontier, and I mean, I think Sheila Hicks deals with textiles and performance, but it's always one person. So kind of thinking about a kind of a group dynamic. And I love the Todd Bontier pieces, but they're always die cut, and there's never any difference. So the difference is just in the kind of the material arrangement, but it's always the same pattern. Kind of see the close up and the kind of the coloring that happens when the material goes from back to front. So just very quickly, in closing, a couple of projects that are happening right now. It's taking some of these installation strategies and actually working with living matter. So this is a competition that I just finished with Tammy Glass and Kendra Ordia. It was actually a project that we dreamt up last time I saw Amy at a conference. So we're working on it and we're working towards prototyping it. There are some glitches because it turns out that plants are a lot more difficult than we thought. So we can fabricate it, but I don't know that we can keep it alive. There's another project that I'm working on right now with Mark Simmons, who's the head researcher at the Wildflower Center, which is a nonprofit that's affiliated with UT that deals with the preservation of native landscape in central Texas and native species. So what he has been working on is actually developing different kind of sustainable products like grass blends, and kind of dealing with kind of unusual applications of native species. And so he's been very interested in working with someone with interior applications. So we just recently formed a team that is going to look at transferring the green roof technology into the interior. So it's an interesting hybrid between kind of hydroponics and the existing green roof technology that's out there. And then this is the site of the next installation that opens at Topps Gallery on February 1st, and that's in Memphis. And I'll start working on that next week. So that's it. Thank you.